Welcome to the first Flow I'm Finally Free. This story is by an amazing survivor who is part of my Flow and Friends group, and she is happy for me to tell her story. Now, before I go into it, I will be doing my makeup and it will be a voiceover. It's something that she has discussed that she would like it to be laid out like that. So I'm not being disrespectful, just a little public service announcement. It is an absolute honour to be telling her story today, and the best way to support the growth of Flow and Friends so that I can help many more survivors is to follow and subscribe. So let's go.
Dear Flo, I'm a survivor of domestic abuse and I am finally free. This is my story. There is a before him and an after him. I think we often look back at the version of us before and one of two things happen. Either you see yourself as a happy, free, whole person who doesn't know the terrors that are out there, or we blame ourselves. We see ourselves as vulnerable, innocent, naive. I think a little bit of both are true. For me, I grew up in a fairly traditional Christian family. I didn't realise just how much that had shaped my view of myself and the world. I thought I had been taught what it meant to be a good person. I think elements of this are true, but I also think that I had a very distorted view of life. Even now, I do not see myself as a good person. I think this is a combination of my upbringing and my abuse. To be a good person in Christianity, there is a plethora of rules you have to follow, and rules that don't even make that much sense. I was so conditioned that we had to aspire to be like Jesus, this perfect man, yet we would never be good enough, and that's why Jesus died on the cross. I struggled with my mental health from the age of 13. I started having anxiety attacks at school. This progressed to a depressive episode at 15, 16, and I developed anorexia soon after. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder at 18. Bearing this in mind, my life before him was not perfect or idyllic. I had been struggling for a long time, but little did I know this was only the start. I think he saw that I was vulnerable, and frankly, I was naive. I had only dated one guy before, and the relationship didn't last very long. I had no experience in serious relationships, and I hadn't even lost my virginity. I was about to be thrown into the deep end. It was 2020, middle of lockdown, and I was age 19. What do you do when you have loads of time on your hands? You jump on the dating apps. Desperate for some semblance of human interaction, I talked to quite a few guys on there. Some conversations were brief, and others I was in contact with for a few weeks. Then I saw him. The first thing that caught my attention was his Welsh rugby shirt. I had been supporting the Welsh rugby team since my childhood. I swiped right. Nothing. I remember thinking, how rude he hadn't swiped right on me. As quickly as the thought came, it left. Thinking nothing of it, I continued swiping. But then, match. He had swiped right on me too, and soon enough a message came through. He said something like, "You're stunning. Sorry, I just had to say that." Intrigued, I replied, and we quickly struck up a conversation. I can't really remember how we got onto the topic of alcohol, but we did. It's something I would later learn was an important topic to him. I remember there being some sort of flirty joking about who could drink more. He was telling me he reckoned I could outdrink him, despite me insisting that I was a lightweight. I found out quickly that this was definitely not the case. This was his first lie. After talking a bit on Tinder, he asked for my Snapchat, a very common thing on dating apps, and now something I refuse to give, especially for people my age. I gave it to him. He sent me a photo message and I sent one back. He later told me he knew he wanted to get to know me when I sent him a photo of my full face, rather than the half face on the camera that was very common at the time. I remember thinking to myself that he was really cute, cuter than he looked in his Tinder profile pictures. I was pleasantly surprised. I'd also like to note, at the time of writing this, having to write him as cute is making me physically gag. The next day, we sent video messages back and forth on Snapchat for the entire day. This is when the first red flag appeared. I didn't really notice that, a common theme in my story. He was drinking a beer in his video, but it wasn't just one beer. By the end of the day, he had drank around 30 beers and was starting on whiskey. Over the next few days, we continued sending video messages to each other until one night he suggested we video called. So we did. The video call lasted 5 hours. We got on like a house on fire and decided to video call the next night, a whopping 11-hour call that ended early hours in the morning. From then on, we video called every evening, as well as sending each other messages all day, every day. There is so much to my story, but to be honest, I have tried writing the whole thing down, and not only would it be an entire novel, but it's also so twisted in my brain that I don't think I even understand it enough. I will try and outline the main events. We met a month or so into chatting in a Morrison's. Very romantic, I know. The most fitting part, we actually met in an alcohol aisle. That night, on the day that we had first met face to face, we told each other we loved each other. We started meeting more regularly. He would come to me, I would go to him. The first time he came down to me, we spent the day together. We went for a picnic and a walk. I showed him some of my favourite spots in the city, and then we had fish and chips for dinner. That's the day we made it official. I went up to his and we hung out for a bit, and then we had sex. It was my first time. I wouldn't say it was particularly romantic, but for my first time, it wasn't bad. I was happy with it. I had a panic attack that night and ended up having to stay the night on the sofa. Ironically, his parents were concerned about something that had already happened. We continued spending time together, and when we weren't together, we were messaging constantly. The thing about us meeting up, though, is that he didn't drive, but I did. At first, he would take the train to make the journey, but this soon stopped. I started driving to see him, and if I weren't staying there, I would drive us back to mine. Then I would drive him back the next day. In August, we went away on our first holiday together, just the two of us. We went to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I really should have known. We had fun, went for walks, cooked, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. But the thing is, we would also be drinking every evening. Nothing too drastic, just a couple of cans of cider each night. For me, he was back on the whiskey. But one night was different. I'm sure to this day that I had maybe 2 cans of cider and then nothing. I woke up the next morning with no memory of the night before. I was also covered in bruises, and he was bragging about the numbers of times we had sex that night. I couldn't remember it. I remember thinking to myself, this isn't quite right. The word rape even came to my mind, but I quickly shoved it back down and got on with the holiday. The day we were meant to leave, I had started feeling really unwell and was quite mentally distressed, but I never made a connection. We ended up having to stay another night as I was not safe to drive. By the time the second lockdown came, we were very attached to each other and I was devastated. I actually was so affected by the whole idea, combined with the general isolation and winter, that I had a depressive bipolar episode. This was a long episode and it took me a long time to notice, but I was becoming lower and lower. Eventually, I attempted suicide and I ended up in A&E, and because I had been so many times in the previous week, I was not assessed by the mental health team and was sent home. My mum was promptly on the phone with private hospitals to get me in for an inpatient stay. She knew if I remained at home, I would not be long for this earth. Hospital was hard. I was still in regular contact with him, but I was also making some incredible friends on the ward, people who I really related to. I had some fantastic groups, started new meds and could see the light at the end of the tunnel. I really thought that this was going to last. Once I had got out, lockdown had also started easing and I was able to start seeing him regularly again. I started a job in the city that he lived in. Despite the fact it was 45 minutes from where I lived, it meant that I could see him more often. The second day of my new job was our first anniversary. We went out to dinner and had a nice night. I had given him a box of letters that I had written to him from the day we became a couple and every important moment since. And I also gave him a voucher for 2 to go axe throwing. He told me, "Your gift is on the way," but I am still waiting for it to arrive. By the June, I started to think about moving out. I was fed up at my parents' house and I also wanted to be closer to him. I was looking at flats in the city. When I was talking to him about this, he suggested we move in together, and so we started looking. I was the one who did all the paperwork, looking for the flats, visiting them, everything. Every single bit of admin for that move went through me. Once we moved in, nothing changed. I had to set up the bills all in my name with my bank account attached. I was relying on him to remember to transfer me money for the rent and bills, and I had to remind him every single month. Honestly, I don't remember much from the time we moved in. It all feels like a blur. I couldn't tell you what had happened when. It feels like I've been given a bunch of tangled wires and I'm trying to uncross them to understand what happened, but it's too hard right now. They are too tangled, and I know it will take time. Christmas has always been my favourite holiday, but he hated it, and he made that very clear. I decorated the whole flat and he just came back and complained. He complained about having to give and receive presents. He did get me a present, although I told him what to get me and it still came late. We had our second anniversary in the June, and again I put a lot of thought and money into a present for him. Some Star Wars Lego. I can't even remember exactly what it was. I just remember it being expensive. Again, nothing from him. He told me he'd made me something and sent it off to finish, but again, nothing ever came. One distinct memory I do have is that we went out for our drinks one night and we came back and he was acting all distressed and was trying to understand why. He kept telling me that if he told me I would hate him and would leave him. Then it came out. He had a baby a year before we met and he had kept it from me for over 2 years. I won't go into the details because although distressing, frankly, it's not my business anymore and going into it isn't going to help anyone. Let's just say there was a reason he was not in that child's life. By July, I was having a manic episode and had to go into hospital. I was really debating it because he was making it difficult for me, but I decided to go for 2 weeks. He criticised me and said, "You said 2 weeks last time, but you were there for 6. So I was adamant that no matter what had happened, 2 weeks was the limit. We were not in constant contact as it had been for the first time, and by the last few days we had an argument that ended in him cutting all contact for the final 2 days. When I finally got him to talk to me, he said he had been busy and that he wasn't blanking me. He spun it around on me so fast that I didn't even realise it was happening. This was a common occurrence. The thing is, I had become so conditioned to expect anger when I said something that annoyed him that I was just trying to placate him by saying this time it had the opposite reaction. When I got home, shit went tits up. Again, this period is very hazy. There were countless arguments and he would go every night without telling me and wouldn't come back until late. This was the most blatant the abuse got because he had stopped hiding it, yet I still didn't see it. I blamed myself. I kept trying to do anything I could to make him happy, but it never worked. This kept going on until the end. It's hard for me to say what the worst thing was because the various things are almost incomparable. Something I really struggle with is the vast amount of red flags he had. Some examples of this are he hid a child from me for over 2 years. He had a meltdown at his parents' house after drinking too much. He shut himself in the bathroom and when I went up to comfort him, he screamed at me and told me that he was going to kill me and push me down the stairs. His mum, who heard all of this, told me not to take it personally and I decided to leave and just go home. Then I got a phone call from him screaming that I left without telling him and some other abuse that frankly I've blocked out. My grandma died whilst I was in the hospital and he had met her a few times and had been invited to attend the funeral. When I asked if he was coming the day before, he told me no because he had shit to do. When I got home, he was still asleep in bed. I still think he cheated on me at the end of the relationship. There were signs, but I didn't really put it together until it was over. He had a bra strap tied onto his key that wasn't mine. This was a thing on TikTok where girlfriends would give their boyfriends their bra straps to wear as a bracelet. When I confronted him on it, he said his friend put it there as a joke. He raped me in the cabin on the holiday. He gave me the silent treatment in the psychiatric hospital. He used to bite me despite me multiple times asking him not to and expressing how much he scared me. He used to taunt me, snapping his jaws and moving towards me just to scare me. He kept loads of knives around the house, including 2 Rambo knives. He was an alcoholic. He was a self-proclaimed cunt and psychopath. He told me he didn't know what love was over a year and a half into our relationship. When I reacted, he told me I couldn't take a joke. He constantly punched the walls in anger. He told me that 2 times he had seen a person stood outside the bedroom window watching me sleep. Later on, he told me that it was me who said this. He was a compulsive liar, not just about serious things, but everything. He told me that before we met, he used to kill bad people for money. He told me he stopped because he met me. He told me horrific and traumatizing stories about this. He told me because he was traditional that before he proposed, he would ask my dad's permission. When I jokingly texted my dad that he had to say yes, he flipped and then told me he would never marry me for the next 4 or so months until one day he changed his mind again. He stabbed a Rambo knife all the way through my sofa. When he told me something sad about himself, I would sometimes tear up, being a very empathetic person. He decided he was never going to tell me anything because I would cry, despite me telling him that I was out of empathy. He told me he had an expiration date, 29 and 3 days, and that would not be changing. He called my best friend a cunt and she was not my best friend for much longer. He told me that everyone at his work had him in their top 3 and some people had crushes on him. Every time he went out with his friends, he got in fights and he loved fighting. He said he enjoyed hurting people. I used to sit at home and worry he would get hurt or get into trouble with the police. He said his ex-girlfriends had all abused him and were crazy. He told me if we had kids in the future, he would use physical punishment. He told me an exercise regime for me to do, and I started doing it, but it triggered my eating disorder, and so I stopped. He constantly berated me for this, never taking his advice and throwing his help back in his face. When we weren't living together and I said I wanted to see him, he would often say that he'd need to speak to his parents at age 20. Whilst I lived with him, I started getting horrific nightmares where I would see a person standing over me with a knife. I was half asleep and half awake and I would scream. He had to grab me to stop me screaming and tell me his name over and over again to stop me fighting him off. He didn't drive, so I drove him everywhere. He told me that he had hits out on people. He told me we had to keep a key inside the door to stop people picking the lock from the other side. He used to drink Stella a lot. He used to tell racist jokes all the time. He called his black friend a monkey and made monkey noises. Apparently his friend didn't mind. He also used the M-word a few times. He used to tell me that he had multiple personalities. You hear so many stories of women who escape their abuser, but this is not my story. Had he have not broken up with me, I'm not sure I would have left. I think he just got fed up of me. Maybe he knew that he had broken so much of me that I was no fun anymore. Maybe he just wanted to move on to a new girl. I can't understand why it happened, and although at the time I was heartbroken, now I am grateful. Maybe he didn't know it, but he set me free. Since coming home from the hospital in July, he treated me like shit. We would argue all the time and he would always turn it back on me. I was toxic. I was treating him like shit. Near the end, I remember crouching beside him crying and him telling me something that had hit me right in my weak spot. He told me, "You are not enough." It was my biggest fear and my deepest self-belief said right there to my face. He told me he was done and I probed, asking what he meant. He just repeated it and repeated it. I asked him to say the words and I needed him to say it, but he wouldn't. I stopped trying. There was no point. I asked him what was going to happen. I was due to move out the next week as our lease was ending and we never sorted out a new place together. We had to sleep in the same bed and coexist together in the same flat for a week. It was awkward as hell and it was sad, but I got through it and I moved to a new place with a new roommate and a new fresh start. I only saw him one more time after that, as it was to pick up some letters from the flat. It was awkward and we didn't interact too much, and then I left. I didn't hear from him again. I got blocked on social media. I thought that was it. I would never hear from him again and I would move on. One day in October, I got a text in the middle of the night. It was from him and it said something like, "I hope you're okay." I decided to text back, "I hope you are too." Sometimes I wish I hadn't responded, but I did, and I can't change that. Those were the last words we spoke to each other. It was a long time before I even realised I had been in an abusive relationship, and even now, 1 year on, sometimes I still don't believe it. I'm currently writing this story in a psychiatric hospital. I've been experiencing symptoms of PTSD since October last year, and I am in the process of being diagnosed and treated for complex PTSD. I've tried EMDR and didn't find it particularly helpful, so now we will come up with a new plan and I keep moving forward. And that's the key, to keep moving forward.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting and giving this amazing, brave lady a platform and a way to be heard. No longer will mainstream media be able to silence us. If you have a story that you would like me to read, please email it at info@florasrecovery.co.uk. Thank you and hopefully see you soon.